Imagine a country with no meaningful naval history, no tradition of projecting power at sea, no aircraft carriers, no nuclear submarines, and a coastline that geography had turned into a strategic liability rather than an asset. Now imagine that same country deciding, in the space of a single generation, to build a fleet capable of challenging the United States Navy on every ocean on Earth simultaneously, not matching it, challenging it, making American admirals lose sleep, forcing American presidents to spend money they had not budgeted, defending against a threat they had not anticipated. That is what the Soviet Union did between 1948 and 1991. What you are about to hear is the complete record of how they did it. Every major warship class, from the last gun cruisers of the Stalin era to the nuclear-powered monsters of the Reagan years. The destroyers, the frigates, the corvettes, the battlecruisers, the carriers, and the submarines, the deep, invisible force that formed the spine of the entire enterprise. The ships that never fired a shot in the war they were built for, and won their strategic argument anyway. Chapter 1. Steal from Nothing, the Birth of a Red Fleet. In the spring of 1945, Soviet soldiers raised their flag over the Reichstag in Berlin. The Red Army had crushed Nazi Germany with the most powerful land force in human history. But on the water, the story was different. The Soviet Navy had spent the war sinking in harbor, bottled in coastal waters, outgunned and outmaneuvered at every turn. No fleet projection, no blue water presence, no threat to anyone beyond its own coastline. What followed over the next 4 decades was one of the most audacious military transformations ever attempted. A continental empire with no naval tradition, no carrier doctrine, no history of projecting power across open ocean, decided to build the second most powerful navy in human history from almost nothing, in under 40 years, against the most technologically advanced maritime power the world had ever seen. This is every major warship the Soviet Union ever built. The classes, the numbers, the doctrine behind each one, and the arms race they forced the West to fight whether it wanted to or not. Chapter 2. Stalin's Iron Wall, Guns, Mass, and the Last Gun Cruisers. The program began in 1948 with a fundamental misreading of the future. Stalin, distrustful of new technology and obsessed with mass, ordered a fleet built on pre-war principles: guns, armor, and numbers. The kind of navy that had already been rendered obsolete by carrier aviation and guided missiles. He ordered it anyway. The result was the Sverdlov-class cruiser, Project 68 bis, the last conventional gun cruiser ever built for any navy in the world. 14 hulls were completed between 1952 and 1959 out of an original order for 40. Each displaced 16,640 tons at full load. 12 152 mm guns in 4 triple turrets, a range of 9,000 nautical miles, a crew of 1,250 men. In 1952, at the moment of commissioning, they were already obsolete. The guided missile had arrived. Stalin had ordered battleships while the age of missiles had begun. The destroyers commissioned alongside them followed the same logic. The Skory class, Project 30 bis, built between 1949 and 1953, totaled 70 hulls, the largest post-war destroyer construction program by any nation. Each displaced just over 3,000 tons, made 36 knots, and carried guns and torpedo tubes in a configuration unchanged from World War II, quantity over quality, mass over precision. 70 ships, that was the opening move. Then came the Kotlin class, Project 56, which refined the formula. 27 hulls, completed between 1953 and 1958. During trials, one Kotlin-class vessel reached 42.9 knots, making it one of the fastest destroyers ever recorded. They were superb conventional warships. But by the time the last one was commissioned, the Soviet Navy was already building something entirely different. The pivot began before Stalin was cold in his grave. Chapter 3: Gorshkov's Gamble, the First Missile Navy. Nikita Khrushchev arrived at the Kremlin convinced that missiles had made the battleship and the gun cruiser as obsolete as the horse cavalry. He slashed naval budgets for conventional construction and poured resources into guided weapons. The man who would execute this transformation was Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Navy in 1956 and arguably the most consequential naval officer of the 20th century. Gorshkov understood something that Western analysts were slow to accept. The Soviet Navy did not need to match the Americans ship for ship. It needed one capability and one capability only: the ability to sink American aircraft carriers before their aircraft could reach Soviet territory. Everything that followed was built to serve that single strategic imperative. The first step was the Kildin-class destroyer, Project 56M, 4 hulls converted from Kotlin hulls, starting in 1958. A single SS-N-1 scrubber anti-ship missile launcher replaced the aft gun battery. It was crude. The SS-N-1 could only carry a nuclear warhead, meaning every engagement was inherently an atomic strike. But it proved the concept: destroyers could carry missiles. The gun was not the future. The Krupny-class destroyer, Project 57 bis, went further. 8 hulls completed between 1959 and 1961, each carrying 12 SS-N-1 missiles and twin launchers, fore and aft. The most heavily armed anti-ship destroyer in the world at the time of its commissioning. Its obsession with anti-ship firepower left it nearly useless for anything else. No real anti-submarine capability, minimal air defense. By 1965, the Navy had already decided to convert all 8 hulls. They became the Cannon class, Project 57A, rebuilt with ASW torpedoes, rocket launchers, and a helicopter pad. The first Soviet destroyer designed for missiles became the first to be scrapped in favor of something more balanced. The Kashin class did what the Krupny could not. Project 61, 25 hulls commissioned from 1962 onward. The world's first large warship powered entirely by gas turbines, 4 M8E units producing up to 96,000 horsepower and driving each hull to 38 knots. The Kashin was the first Soviet destroyer capable of defending itself against NATO carrier aircraft at low altitude, carrying 2 SA-N-1 Goa surface-to-air missile systems. A true multi-mission warship, the template for everything that followed. But destroyers were escorts. The carrier killers needed heavier weapons and longer reach. The Kinda-class cruiser, Project 58, 4 hulls entering service from 1962, was the Soviet Navy's first dedicated missile cruiser, designed from the keel up to destroy aircraft carriers. Each carried 8 P-35 Progress anti-ship missiles, NATO designation SSN, 3 Shadok, with a range of 460 kilometers. Enough to strike an American carrier group from beyond the range of its own defensive fighters. The fatal flaw was magazine depth: 8 missiles, no at-sea reloads. 4 ships, 4 salvos, and then the cruisers were expensive passengers. The Kinda was a weapon of first strike, not sustained combat. The Cresta 1, Project 1134, 4 hulls entering service in 1967, tried to correct this by adding anti-submarine weapons and helicopters alongside the anti-ship missiles, trading some firepower for versatility. Then the Cresta 2, Project 1134A, shifted emphasis again. Out went the anti-ship missiles entirely. In came the Metel ASW complex, anti-submarine rockets, and a dedicated hunting suite. The reason was Polaris. American nuclear submarines hiding beneath the Atlantic, with ballistic missiles aimed at Soviet cities, had become the primary threat, and the Soviet Navy needed ships that could find and kill them. That same anxiety shaped a ship unlike anything built before it. Chapter 4: Reach and Hunt, Cruisers, Frigates, and the ASW Obsession. The Moskva-class helicopter cruiser, Project 1123, 2 hulls commissioned in 1967 and 1969, was the Soviet Navy's first admission that it could not hunt submarines with surface ships alone. It needed dedicated aviation platforms. Each Moskva carried 14 Kamov-Ka-25 helicopters on a full-length flight deck aft, combined with a conventional missile-armed bow section. The official designation was not aircraft carrier. Soviet doctrine had defined the carrier as an offensive weapon inappropriate for a defensive navy, so the Moskva became a helicopter cruiser. The distinction was political, the function was naval aviation. The design was a compromise, and everyone knew it. The flight deck was too small, the ship too unstable in heavy Atlantic swells, and 14 helicopters were not enough to seriously threaten American SSBNs dispersed across millions of square miles of ocean. Both hulls were out of frontline service within a decade of commissioning. The Kara class, Project 1134B, 7 hulls, completed between 1971 and 1979, was a more honest answer. The largest gas turbine-powered warship in the world at the time of its construction, displacing 9,700 tons at full load, reaching 34 knots. The first Soviet warship to carry every major weapon system of its era simultaneously: anti-ship missiles, surface-to-air missiles with a 5.5-kilometer reach, the SAN-3 Goblet system, the first Soviet naval SAM capable of engaging high-altitude aircraft, anti-submarine rockets, torpedo tubes, 2 helicopters. The Kara tried to do everything at once. The Americans called it a cruiser. The Soviets called it a large anti-submarine ship. The argument revealed how poorly existing categories fit what Soviet engineers were actually building. The rest of the fleet needed escorts. That meant frigates and corvettes built in numbers the cruiser program could never match. The Krivok class, Project 1135, entering service in 1970 and eventually producing 42 hulls across 3 variants, was the backbone of Soviet ASW surface warfare. Designed specifically to hunt American nuclear submarines in the choke points of the North Atlantic and North Pacific. Each displaced 3,575 tons and carried a 4-round SSN-14 Silex ASW missile launcher in the bow with a 5.5-kilometer range, 8 torpedo tubes, 2 RBU 6000 anti-submarine rocket launchers, speed over 32 knots. In 1970, it was the most capable, dedicated ASW frigate in any navy, and the Soviet yards built 42 of them. Even smaller and more numerous was the Grisha class, Project 1124 Albatros, built between 1970 and 1990, approximately 80 hulls across 5 variants, not a blue water ship. Its mission was protecting Soviet home waters, harbor approaches, and the bases from which ballistic missile submarines deployed. A floating guard dog for the Soviet strategic deterrent. Small, fast, and absolutely essential. At the other end of the threat spectrum sat the Nanuchka-class missile corvette, Project 1234, 47 hulls. A 660-ton vessel carrying 6 P-120 Malachit anti-ship missiles, NATO designation SSN-9 Siren, with a range of 150 kilometers. The Nanuchka gave even the smallest Soviet naval bases the ability to threaten NATO surface groups far out at sea. Coastal defense with reach. Then came the ships that made Western naval planners rethink the entire concept of sea control. The Kirov class, Project 1144 Orlan, the 4 hulls commissioned between 1980 and 1,998 were not cruisers. NATO called them battle cruisers because no existing category covered what they actually were. The largest surface combatant warship built by any navy since World War II, 252 meters long, 28,000 tons at full load. Nuclear-powered, 2 KN3 reactors, supplemented by oil-fired boilers for surge speed, giving effectively unlimited range at 20 knots and 32 knots when full power was applied. A crew of 710. The armament was extraordinary. 20 P-700 Granite missiles, NATO designation SSN-19 shipwreck, with a range of 625 kilometers and a warhead choice of 750 kilograms conventional or a 500 kiloton nuclear option. A single salvo from one Kirov was designed to exceed the saturation threshold of any carrier battle group's defenses. The defensive battery was equally staggering. 96 S-300F long-range surface-to-air missiles, 40 short-range OSAM missiles, 10 torpedo tubes. When the fourth Kirov, Yuri Andropov, was commissioned in 1998, the Soviet Union had been gone for 7 years. The ship outlasted the empire that built it. Reagan's response to the Kirov was to reactivate all 4 Iowa-class battleships at a cost exceeding $1.5 billion. The only American warships whose armor belts might survive a granite hit, the Slava class, answered the cost question. Project 1164 Atlant. 3 hulls commissioned from 1,983, each displacing 12,000 tons and making 32 knots on steam turbines. Conventionally powered alternatives to the nuclear Kirov, designed for the same primary mission. Each carried 16 P-1000 Vulcan anti-ship missiles in 8 twin launchers mounted on the ship's sides, the most distinctive visual signature in the Soviet surface fleet. Soviet planners stationed 1 Slava per fleet, 1 in the Black Sea, 1 in the Pacific, 1 in the Northern Fleet. Every American carrier battle group operating in any ocean within their range faced a dedicated carrier killer within its operational theater. Alongside the Slava and the Kirov, the destroyers went to sea in pairs. The Sovereignty class, Project 956, 21 hulls, completed between 1,980 and 1,992. The last major surface warship class in the world to be powered by steam turbines, a deliberate trade of quick acceleration for sustained endurance. Each displaced 8,000 tons and carried 8 P-270 Mosquet missiles, NATO designation SSN-22 Sunburn, traveling at Mach 2.35, the fastest anti-ship missile in any navy at the time of its deployment. Twin 130mm automatic gun turrets for shore bombardment, a ship built specifically to kill other surface ships. The Udaloy, Project 1155, 13 hulls completed between 1,980 and 1,994 ran beside it with a completely different mission. Where the Sovereignty was a surface striker, the Udaloy was a submarine hunter. 2 Ka-27 Helix ASW helicopters, 8 SSN-1, 4 Silex missiles, massive hull sonar, gas turbines giving 10,500 nautical mile range at 14 knots, enough to operate alone in any ocean. The 2 classes were built together, deployed together, and operated as matched pairs, 1 to kill ships, 1 to kill submarines. The Kuznetsov came last, and almost came too late. Chapter 5. The Carrier Question, Aviation at Sea the Soviet Way. Soviet naval doctrine had resisted the aircraft carrier for 20 years. Carriers were American weapons, offensive instruments of power projection, philosophically incompatible with a navy that described itself as defensive. But by the late 1960s, the contradiction had become too large to ignore. The Navy needed airborne anti-submarine cover it could not provide from shore. It needed fighters that could intercept American maritime patrol aircraft hunting Soviet submarines deep in the Atlantic. Helicopters were not enough. The compromise came in 1975 with the Kyiv class, Project 1143, 4 hulls commissioned over the following decade: Kyiv, Minsk, Novorossiysk, and Admiral Gorshkov, each displacing approximately 43,500 tons at full load, with an angled flight deck operating roughly 36 aircraft, including Yak, 3 8-Forger jump jets, and Ka-25 and Ka-27 helicopters, officially designated heavy aircraft carrying cruisers. The classification was not purely semantic. It allowed Kyiv-class ships to transit the Turkish Straits under the Montreux Convention, which barred true aircraft carriers, a doctrinal position enforced by treaty paperwork. The Yak 3 8-Forger was the fixed-wing centerpiece of the Kyiv Air Wing, and it was deeply disappointing. A combat radius of 195 kilometers, with weapons load less than half the reach of the American A-7 Corsair it was notionally meant to counter. The Kyiv's real lethality was not its aircraft. It was the 8 P-500 Basalt anti-ship missiles with a 550-kilometer range built into the bow section alongside the flight deck. More offensive missile firepower than most pure warships of any navy, fitted into what was nominally an aviation platform. NATO planners needed entirely different assets to counter each half of what a single Kyiv represented. 8 P-500 missiles in the bow, but the flight deck told a different story. The Admiral Kuznetsov, Project 1143.5, laid down in 1985 and commissioned in 1990, was the Soviet Union's first true aircraft carrier, 67,500 tons. A full-length flight deck, a ski-jump bow ramp rather than steam catapults, a deliberate choice preserving deck space and simplifying machinery, at the cost of aircraft maximum payload on takeoff. The air wing centered on the Su-27K, later designated the Su-33, a naval variant of the flanker with a combat radius exceeding 1,000 kilometers. For the first time, Soviet naval aviation could intercept aircraft threatening its submarines from ranges beyond shore-based coverage. The Kuznetsov retained 12 P-700 Granite missiles in below-deck launchers, a carrier that could strike surface targets at 625 kilometers without using a single aircraft. Soviet naval tradition, even inside the hull of an aircraft carrier. A second hull, Varyag, was 70% complete when Soviet funding collapsed in 1991. It sat unfinished in a Ukrainian shipyard for years, sold to China for $20 million in 1998, towed across the Pacific to Dalian, completed and commissioned as the Liaoning. China's first aircraft carrier began its life as a half-built Soviet ship, abandoned in a former Soviet republic. Below the surface, the story was even more extraordinary. Chapter 6: The Deep War, 5 Generations of Soviet Submarines. The Soviet submarine force was the foundation on which Gorshkov's entire strategic vision rested. Surface ships could be tracked, identified, and targeted from the air. Submarines could not. They were the invisible fleet, the force that made the Soviet Navy genuinely terrifying to Western planners, rather than merely challenging. The program began with the Whiskey class, Project 613, built between 1951 and 1958. 215 hulls in the Soviet Union alone, 21 more built under license in China, making it the most produced submarine class in history after the German type EVIIC. Each was directly reverse-engineered from the captured German type XXI U-boat, whose unfinished hulls Soviet engineers recovered from Baltic shipyards in 1945. The high-capacity battery system, the streamlined hull, the snorkel, all of it copied, refined, and mass-produced. The Whiskey was proof of concept. The Soviet Union could build submarines in industrial quantities. Building in parallel with the Whiskey was the Zulu class, Project 611, 26 hulls completed between 1952 and 1,957. Larger, longer-ranged, assigned the most demanding ocean patrols. In 1955, a Zulu 5 variant conducted the Soviet Navy's first ballistic missile launch from a submarine. 2 years before Sputnik, 3 years before the American Polaris program achieved the same result. The Soviets got there first, and almost nobody noticed. The Romeo class, Project 633, followed with 20 Soviet hulls, completed between 1,957 and 1,961. A refined whiskey, transitional, quickly overtaken by nuclear propulsion. But the design was sold to China, where 84 more were eventually built from Soviet plans, making the Romeo the most widely exported Soviet submarine design in history. Then came the Foxtrot class, Project 641, 58 hulls for the Soviet Navy, 17 more exported, India, Cuba, Libya. The Foxtrot went everywhere the Soviet Union wanted a presence. In October 1962, a Foxtrot-class submarine, B-59, was in the Caribbean carrying a nuclear torpedo, out of contact with Moscow for days. Depth-charged by American destroyers whose crews did not know what they were hunting. The commanding officer believed war had already begun. The political officer concurred. Only Vasily Arkhipov, the flotilla chief of staff embarked on B-59, refused to authorize the launch. One man's refusal. That was how close it came. That same year, the first nuclear boats were already at sea. The November class, Project 627 Kit, 13 hulls starting in 1958, the Soviet Union's first nuclear attack submarines. Built fast and deployed fast, because the Americans had already launched USS Nautilus, and the strategic implications were clear. The November paid for that speed. Chronic reactor problems, crew casualties from radiation exposure, and noise. The November was acoustically loud, so detectably loud that American sonar operators could track individual boats at distances that Soviet engineers had never anticipated. The speed advantage was real. The tactical value was not. The Echo 1, Project 659, 5 hulls starting in 1961, introduced the first submarine-launched cruise missiles capable of targeting American carrier groups. 6 P-5 Pyatorka missiles in tubes that had to be raised above the waterline before firing. Surface exposure during launch. Every Echo 1 attack began with a submarine announcing its presence. The Echo 2, Project 675, 29 hulls, added 3 more missiles and targeting capability against moving ships. The exposure requirement remained. Both classes were built on a compromise that their successors would finally resolve. The resolution came with the Charlie class, Project 670 SCAT, 17 hulls, entering service from 1967. The first Soviet submarine capable of launching anti-ship cruise missiles from fully submerged depth. 8 P-70 Amethyst missiles, NATO designation SS-N, 7 Starbright, 6.5-kilometer range, fired from below the surface. No exposure, no announcement. The carrier group you were hunting did not know you were there until the missiles arrived. 600 meters down was a different story entirely. The Victor 1, Project 671, 13 hulls from 1967, was the boat that first made American submariners genuinely uncomfortable, quieter than anything before it, 31 knots submerged. 6 torpedo tubes capable of firing the RPK-2 Vyuga nuclear ASW missile at 40-kilometer range. Then Victor 2nd, Project 671 RT, 7 hulls, and Victor 3, Project 671 RTMK, 25 hulls, each iteration progressively quieter. Victor 3 came close enough to American Los Angeles-class noise levels to trigger serious alarm in the intelligence community. But the Alpha class, Project 705 Lyra, was in a category of its own. 7 hulls completed between 1971 and 1,983, the fastest submarine ever built, before or since. 41 knots submerged. The hull was titanium, not steel. Test depth of 400 meters, below the crush depth of every torpedo in the NATO inventory at the time. The propulsion system was a lead-bismuth, liquid metal-cooled nuclear reactor, never replicated in any submarine by any other navy. The reactor could never be fully shut down. The coolant solidified at room temperature. Each Alpha required shore-based heating equipment even when berthed. The crew was 31 officers, no enlisted men, operating through automation that was 20 years ahead of its time. The U.S. Navy's response produced two programs directly: the ADCAP torpedo upgrade and the early Sea Lance missile, both engineered specifically to achieve the speed and depth needed to kill a submarine that could outrun every existing weapon. The Alpha forced the West to invent new weapons from scratch. Alongside the Alpha, the Sierra class, Project 945, Barracuda, took titanium construction to its logical conclusion. 4 hulls completed between 1,984 and 1,992. A test depth of 600 meters, deeper than virtually every NATO ASW system could reach. Small production numbers by Soviet standards, because titanium hulls were extraordinarily expensive even for the Soviet defense budget. But at 600 meters, expense was irrelevant. The ballistic missile submarines followed their own evolutionary line, from barely viable to genuinely apocalyptic. The Gulf class, Project 629, a conventionally powered ballistic missile submarine entering service in 1958, carried 3 R-13 missiles in an enlarged sail, a stopgap acknowledged as such by Soviet planners from the beginning. The Hotel class, Project 658, 8 nuclear-powered hulls starting in 1960, replaced it. First Soviet nuclear SSBN, still limited. The R-13 Sarki missile had a range of only 650 kilometers, meaning Hotel-class submarines had to approach the American coast to threaten target cities. Close enough to be found, close enough to be killed. The Yankee class, Project 667A, changed that. 34 hulls from 1,967, 16 ballistic missiles in 2 vertical rows, the first truly modern Soviet SSBN layout. Range extended to 2,400 kilometers. In late 1969, American intelligence confirmed Yankee-class submarines patrolling 1,500 miles off the Atlantic coast. The revelation triggered a classified crisis that directly accelerated the Trident program. The Delta classes, Projects 667B through 667B DMR, built from 1972 onward across 4 successive variants, totaling 43 hulls, moved the missiles out to intercontinental range. Delta 1 through Delta 4. The R-29 Vysota missile family extended reach to 8,300 kilometers. Delta 4, the most capable variant, carried 16 R-29 RMU Sineva missiles, each with 4 independently targeted warheads of 100 kilotons. A single Delta 4 could destroy 64 cities simultaneously while never leaving Arctic waters adjacent to Soviet territory. Then came something that had no precedent in the history of submarine construction. The Typhoon class, Project 941, 6 hulls completed between 1,981 and 1,989, 48,000 tons submerged. Still the largest submarine ever built. The size was engineering necessity, not excess. The R-39 RIF missiles each weighed 84 tons and required a pressure hull diameter that no single conventional hull could accommodate. Soviet designers solved this by building 2 parallel pressure hulls side by side, with the 20 missile tubes positioned between them. The result was a vessel wider than it was deep, with a reinforced sail capable of breaking through 3 meters of Arctic ice, operating under the polar ice cap, where American attack submarines struggled to follow and track. The Typhoon carried its crew of 160 inches, conditions unusual for any submarine, Individual officer cabins, a swimming pool, a sauna, a gymnasium, not luxury, operational necessity. 90 to 120 days, submerged under Arctic ice. The men who crewed these boats needed more than a rack and a galley to remain combat effective. Each Typhoon carried 200 independently targeted warheads, one submarine, 200 cities. 200 warheads per hull, but something different was hunting the carriers. The Oscar class, Project 949 Ante, 14 hulls, completed between 1980 and 1992, was designed for one mission: approach an American carrier battle group undetected and fire 24 P-700 Granite missiles simultaneously. A salvo calculated to exceed the saturation threshold of any defensive system the carrier's escorts could field. Each Oscar displaced 24,000 tons submerged, the largest cruise missile submarine ever built. The P-700 Granite was not a dumb weapon. The missiles in a salvo coordinated with each other autonomously. The lead missile climbed for target acquisition while the rest flew low to avoid radar. If the lead was shot down, the salvo redistributed assignments automatically. Oscar II stretched the hull by 10 meters for improved electronics. 11 of 14 hulls were this variant. And then, at the end of the Cold War, the Akula. The Akula class, Project 971 Shchuka B, entering service in 1986, not the largest, not the fastest, not the deepest diving, the quietest. 3 decades of progressive noise reduction culminated in a submarine that American intelligence analysts, when they finally assessed its acoustic signature, found had essentially closed the gap with the Los Angeles class. The advantage the U.S. Navy had held since the 1960s, hunted and measured and refined across 30 years, gone. The classified assessment of the Akula's capability was so alarming that it was not acknowledged publicly until years after the Cold War ended. Chapter 7: The Empire Beneath the Waves, What It All Meant. By 1985, the Soviet Navy operated over 1,600 vessels, 380 submarines, 70,000 naval aviation personnel, assembled in under 40 years by a nation that, in 1945, had no blue water fleet, no carrier aviation, no nuclear submarines, no intercontinental missiles, and no tradition of naval power projection whatsoever. The fleet never fought the war it was built for. The P-700 Granite missiles were never fired at an American carrier. The Akulas never engaged an Ohio-class SSBN. The Typhoons never launched their 200 warheads from beneath the Arctic ice. The Oscar class never executed the coordinated carrier group saturation strike its designers had spent a decade perfecting. What the fleet did instead was force the United States to spend hundreds of billions of dollars building defenses against it: faster torpedoes, to kill the Alpha; quieter submarines, to shadow the Akula; carrier battle group air defense systems specifically architected around the P-700 Granite saturation scenario; the Iowa battleships, reactivated specifically because the Kirov existed. Every dollar the Americans spent defending against the Soviet Navy was a dollar not spent elsewhere. The fleet won its strategic argument without ever firing a shot. When the Soviet Union dissolved in December 1991, the ships rusted. Not sunk by an enemy, not destroyed in battle. Simply abandoned by the state that had ordered, designed, built, crewed, and deployed them across 4 decades of the most intense naval competition in history. The Typhoons sat at the pier in Severodvinsk. The Kirovs lost their reactor fuel allocations. The Akulas went into maintenance backlogs that never cleared. A navy built from nothing, expanded to global reach, and then left to dissolve in harbor. The most powerful fleet a land power had ever assembled, silent at the end, not because it lost, but because the country that built it ceased to exist before the war it was preparing for could begin.